History is not only shaped by wars and leaders. Sometimes, the true nature of a system is revealed by its borders. The Soviet Union was one of those systems. One of the largest states in the world, yet its citizens lived with heavily restricted movement. The question is simple. Why could Soviet citizens not travel freely? The answer lies within the system itself. Borders were not just lines, they were instruments of control. In Soviet ideology, the state was not just a political structure. It was a centralized system that regulated social order, where people lived, worked, moved, and whether they could leave the country. All were monitored. Borders were not only to protect against external threats, but to preserve internal stability, because free movement creates comparison, and comparison creates questions. Leaving the country was not a right, it was a privilege. Soviet citizens could not simply decide to travel abroad. They needed state permission, political reliability checks, approval from their workplace, in some cases security clearance. The process could take months, sometimes years. Most citizens were never granted permission. Foreign travel was not freedom, it was selective access. Fear of defection. For Soviet authorities, the greatest risk was people not returning, especially scientists, athletes, artists, diplomatic staff. Those who traveled abroad were closely monitored. Sometimes family members remained in the USSR to ensure return. Harsh, but that was how the system operated. The information barrier. Borders were not only physical, they were also informational. Many Soviet citizens secretly listened to foreign radio stations, had limited access to Western films and music, could not read foreign newspapers or magazines. Exposure to different ways of life was considered decent. Internal passport system. Even inside the Soviet Union, movement was not fully free. The Propiska registration system required citizens to live only where officially registered. Moving to major cities, especially Moscow or Leningrad, was extremely difficult. This allowed the state to control internal migration as well. The psychology of a closed system. Decades of restricted movement shaped public mindset. Many people feared the outside world, saw change as risky, valued stability over freedom. The system did not only control borders, it shaped perception. The 1980s cracks began to appear. Economic stagnation, technological lag, and growing information flow began weakening the system. With Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, borders gradually loosened, travel became more possible. The outside world became visible. These changes also transformed the system itself. After the borders opened in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Suddenly, millions experienced free travel for the first time. For some, it was liberation. For others, uncertainty, because freedom is not only the opening of doors, it is the responsibility of choice. Conclusion. Soviet borders were not merely geographical lines. They were mechanisms of system preservation. Why was free travel restricted? Because free movement encourages free thought. And for some systems, nothing is more dangerous than that. History shows us this. Sometimes borders are not about land, but about control. Imagine a line on a map, but this line isn't just a geographical marker. It's a wall, both physical and psychological, that shapes the lives of millions. This was the reality of the Soviet border system, a formidable barrier that defined an entire era. Let's journey back in time to understand what it truly meant to live on one side of the Iron Curtain. The concept of a tightly controlled border didn't just appear overnight. Its roots stretch back to the early days of the Soviet Union. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the new government was fragile, surrounded by hostile powers. To protect the revolution, they established the border troops, an elite force tasked with sealing the nation's frontiers. But this wasn't just about stopping foreign spies. It was also about preventing their own citizens from leaving. The state saw immigration as a betrayal, a rejection of the socialist utopia they were trying to build. This mentality solidified into what the West would later call the Iron Curtain. This wasn't a single wall, but a vast network of fences, watchtowers, minefields, and heavily armed patrol zones, stretching for thousands of kilometers. Think of the Berlin Wall, but imagine that on a continental scale. Crossing wasn't just difficult. It was often a death sentence. Guards were under strict orders to shoot to kill anyone attempting to flee. The official term for an escapee was izmenik rodine, or traitor to the motherland, a crime punishable by death, even in absentia. Life within these borders was just as controlled. At the heart of this internal control was the infamous propiska, or residency permit system. This wasn't just an address on an ID card. Your propiska dictated where you could live, work, and even access basic services like healthcare and education. Want to move from a small village to a major city like Moscow or Leningrad, you needed special permission, which was incredibly difficult to obtain. This system effectively tied people to their assigned locations, preventing unauthorized internal migration and making it easier for the state to monitor its population. And who did the monitoring? The KGB, the Committee for State Security. The KGB's reach was immense. Its border troops guarded the physical frontiers, but its domestic directorates kept an eye on everyone inside. Every factory, university, and apartment block had its informants. Any mention of wanting to travel abroad, or even expressing too much interest in Western culture, could land you on a watch list. Applying for foreign travel was a daunting process. It wasn't a right, but a privilege granted only to the most loyal and vetted citizens. You'd have to fill out extensive questionnaire, the Ankita, detailing your entire life story, your relatives, your political views. You'd be interviewed by party officials and KGB officers. They would scrutinize your loyalty, looking for any sign of dissent or potential for defection. A distant relative who lived abroad. Your application was likely denied. A careless political joke you told years ago. Denied. The process was designed to be invasive and intimidating for those who were granted permission, usually for official delegations, sports teams, or cultural exchanges. The surveillance didn't stop. Groups were always accompanied by a commissar or a KGB handler, whose job was to prevent contact with locals and watch for any signs of defection. Travelers were given very little foreign currency, just enough to cover basic necessities, making independent activities nearly impossible. They were constantly reminded that their families back home were, in effect, hostages, ensuring their return. This system had a devastating impact on families. Imagine being separated from your parents, siblings, or children by an impenetrable border. Letters were censored, phone calls were monitored, and the chances of a reunion were virtually zero. Generations grew up knowing their relatives only through faded photographs and heavily redacted letters. This created a deep, collective trauma of separation and loss that echoed through families for decades. Certain social groups faced unique challenges. Scientists, for instance, were caught in a frustrating paradox. The state wanted them to be at the cutting edge of research, but it was terrified of them sharing secrets or being lured by the West. Access to international journals was restricted. Attending conferences abroad was a rare privilege reserved for the most trusted party members. This intellectual isolation stifled innovation and created a sense of immense frustration among the brightest minds. Artists, writers, and musicians faced a similar struggle. Their work was supposed to serve the state, promoting socialist ideals. But true art thrives on freedom of expression. Those who dare to create work that was deemed too Western, abstract, or critical of the regime were branded as they were blacklisted, unable to publish, perform, or exhibit. Their creative spirit was confined by ideological walls, just as their bodies were confined by physical ones. For many, the only way to be free was to risk everything in a desperate attempt to defect. Living in this closed society had profound long-term psychological effects. It cultivated a sense of learned helplessness, a feeling that your life was not your own. People became adept at reading between the lines, at speaking in code, and at maintaining a public face of conformity while harboring private doubts. This constant self-censorship and fear of reprisal led to a pervasive atmosphere of distrust, even among friends and neighbors. The world outside the Soviet Union became a mythical place, a blend of propaganda-fueled demonization and whispered, idealized dreams. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was the symbolic end of the Iron Curtain. For the first time in generations, the borders began to open. It was a moment of incredible euphoria, but it also unleashed decades of pent-up longing, frustration, and grief. The legacy of the Soviet border system is a powerful reminder that a border is never just a line on a map. It's a tool of control, that can shape the destiny of nations and the inner worlds of every person living within it. Thanks for watching, and if you found this history as fascinating as I do, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon to stay updated with our latest notifications.